Hey, all you cool cats and kittens. Welcome back. Hope you had a nice Easter, nice little 4-day departure there. This will be our last of the review kind of presentations. Tomorrow we'll actually go back into period 8 a little bit. And that's where we're going to spend the rest of the month of April on period 8 and 9. And then going to May, we'll start to segue to reviewing for our AP exam and or final. So this is the second half of period 7. We had done the domestic portion last, and this time, while the ground, from a time standpoint, is the same. The topic still 1890 to 1945, and we see that with the start of imperialism being in 1890 and the end of World War II driving the end point. So in terms of imperialism, we'll use the Spanish-American War as kind of an apex of that. And while we won't get into like the military stuff of the world wars, it's just really not what the AP curriculum is. We won't, talk about General Pershing and all that fun stuff. We will talk about its ramifications in World War One's case. It's going to be much more of what it does for America's position in the world, and in World War II's case, it's going to have much more to do with kind of impacts socially because of the war. So in World War One, we'll talk about Wilson's plan for peace, the 14 points, the League of Nations that's created. In World War II, we'll talk about the Lend-Lease Act, cash and carry, industrialization, and then a lot of the domestic changes that occur for different minority groups, women, and also some of the uh, restrictions placed on American citizens. So let's get into it. Imperialism. We spent a good chunk of time talking about what it means and why it happened. I always think of Star Wars with imperialism, right? Like the Empire, the Imperial March, dun 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 dun, because that's the connection here. It's America continuing its expansion. We had seen in earlier periods Manifest Destiny, the conquering of the continent, but that doesn't stop just because we hit an ocean, right? Now we're looking around the world for a variety of reasons, be it economic reasons, like we need to expand our markets so we can continue producing and selling. We need to show off this new military might that America's created, like in Mahan's philosophy on naval presence around the world. And also this idea of American democracy or freedom slash civilization. It our job to expand that, bring it to other people, whether they kind of ask for it or not. And we see that with the Spanish American War, is such a great example of this. You noted yellow journalists, different than our muckrakers from Progressive era. These were sensationalist journalists, and they were drumming up conflict in Cuba, which Spain had controlled, to try and encourage imperialism. And this led to, with the explosion of the Maine, which yellow journalists were quick to blame on Spain, which we now know was a malfunction, but it got massive American support. And it was done under the guise of freeing Cuba. So you actually see things like the Teller and Platt Amendments, which have stipulations in them of American intervention, but America does not take Cuba completely under control, which is different than other things America wins in this war, like Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines. We'll actually see a massive conflict in the Philippines where America is trying to promote its own self-interest there at the expense of the people. And that's something I think our book does a great job explaining in terms of the kind of balancing act America is trying to achieve in this period. In one hand, it's trying to be it wants to promote American ideals of democracy and freedom. But on the other hand, there's financial and other incentives to kind of go against those more moralistic ideas. And it's always a balancing act. The Spanish American War definitely gives us this mindset of big stick diplomacy, or as Roosevelt starts to do, he starts to enlarge the Monroe Doctrine. That was much more of a, hey, stay out of the Western Hemisphere, it's ours, to Europe. Now, the Roosevelt corollary is actually saying our military intervention will be expanded. We will be the police presence in this region. We will settle any issues you may have. And that's what this image on the right is really showing us here, right? It's Roosevelt walking with the giant stick. He's got the Navy towed behind him, the debt collectors. This is them going into the Western Hemisphere and really controlling it. We'll see this change differently with the good neighbor policy much later, the Alliance for Progress with Kennedy. Um, the Anti-Imperialism League does show that not all Americans are involved in this kind of mentality. Mark Twain's a famous anti-imperialist. We read his speech about how he used to be a red hot imperialist, right? The eagle's wings screaming across the Pacific. But then when they start to see what's happening in places like the Philippines, how we see senators like Beveridge decrying the Filipinos as children, that a lot see this as actually contrary to American ideals, not supporting them. Now, America tried to stay out of World War One for a very long time, but we did eventually in 1917 finally get involved. That German unrestricted warfare, the Zimmerman Note, all brought us into the forefront. And we saw once America was in this huge kind of anti-German feeling, is an anti-German American feeling in the US, from banning the language to discrimination to propaganda posters. And when the war ends, Woodrow Wilson comes up with a plan to try and prevent this from ever occurring, his 14-point plan for peace, notable for self-determination for certain nation states, rethinking of rethinking of colonial boundaries, going into economic freedoms, as he would put it. But his 14th point was this League of Nations, this idea that the global conflicts could be solved by having an organization involving all the nations. And as we can see in our image here, even though it's Wilson's brainchild and does get created, the American people and the Senate mostly are now accepting this idea of isolationism, kind of echoed by Washington in his farewell address. And even though it is Wilson's plan, the US will not join the League of Nations, kind of setting up for failure from the get go. Now, another big change because of World War One was suffrage. By 1920, we actually see the 19th Amendment get passed and women's right to vote not being a state by state issue anymore, but now across the entire country. A lot of this had to do with the role women played in the war, maybe not so on the battlefields, but they're stepping in and keeping American industry alive. Turned a lot of heads as far as, well, women's participation kind of proved that they were capable of voting. Now, they obviously did not need to prove this right to anyone, but that was the case here. This is a good or newspaper to use because it's the Lowell Sun, right? Lowell, Massachusetts, where the Lowell Mill girls were, so you can kind of see that connection. Now, we then talked about how the Roaring Twenties occurred, flapper movements, counterculture, lost generation, and then the depression that hit in the 30s. And we mentioned FDR's New Deal plans and the success they had, but also if we really want to look at the victor of the Great Depression, it's got to be World War II. Because as Europe starts to plunge back into war, on the left here, we see the Lend-Lease Act. This is kind of America's pinnacle of economic involvement. How first we tried to stay neutral completely, then we started to do cash and carry policies that were kind of turning our backs on our neutrality acts, and then we started to actually lend and lease military aid and supplies to just one side, the Allies. So the British, the French, the Russians, the Chinese, those were the sides we were supplying. And as you can see in the graph on the right, boy, oh boy, as horrible as it is to say, war is great for the economy. It's putting everyone to work. And once Pearl Harbor hits, we start to have millions of men mobilized for war. This really has a cascading effect. Now we are in a total war mentality. The entire economy is now revamped and rejuvenated for World War II. And while there's plenty to be said about the military aspect of World War II, from D Day and the invasions of Italy and Europe to the Pacific theater and island hopping, we focus mostly on the social ramifications of the war. For women in particular, you start to see like Rosie the Riveter become the symbol of female power. And while women step in remarkable strength and force, it's kind of a question of, for women, this is in their mind the new normal. But as we'll find out when the war ends, for many, this new role for women was a temporary measure, more of a wartime sacrifice than a full shift. For African Americans, now there's numerous new job opportunities. You start to see, even though the army's still segregated, movements from the Great Migration in northern cities now be getting new job opportunities. Immigrants, in particular, are starting to get those new placements in work. By no means fully fair, though. A good example would be the Bracero program set up, this kind of labor contract set up between Mexico and America, where it will continue throughout after the war. On paper, it looks good. It's not undercutting American wages. It's filling a labor need, but in actuality, it is undercutting American wages. Many workers are being abused and mistreated, so it is a shady dealing. Most notably, though, we start to see, much like German Americans faced discrimination in World War One, in World War II, FDR will actually do Executive Order 9066. I'm doing that off the top of my head. And how Nisei, American-born Japanese, and other Japanese citizens and immigrants are placed into internment camps where they are there against their will, held without trial, and it's even taken to Supreme Court. Korematsu, Fred Korematsu takes the Supreme Court, and they rule against him. They say this is a lawful act during wartime. The U.S. will apologize later, and in the 80s actually issue like reparation payments, but it's still a very dark moment in American history. We know the war ends with the atomic bomb dropping on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and when we pick up period uh, 8, we'll start to see more of the Cold War and how this conflict still continues. So we'll talk about that next.